Hi, and welcome to Alan Drinks Whiskey and Talks About Books. And today we are talking about When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill. It has been a long time since I have done this, mostly because I kind of try to do this when I have the house more or less to myself. And this year I had a preschooler who started, or I had a toddler who started preschool. And so we'd come home together after school, and I did not have that kind of time. And so. Uh, yeah, it's been like since Christmas since I've done this, but I'm really excited to talk about this book today. It's one of the best books I have read in a long time. I was entranced by it like 10% of the way in, and that stayed with me until the end. So, without further ado, let's talk about When Women Were Dragons. So, this is some speculative fiction in which society is more or less like ours, except for that women can turn into dragons. What I thought was really interesting, this is historical, like within the universe of the novel. Like, going back to like the dawn of humanity, there was even like I think somewhere in Europe, people that were protected by dragons, and then um, basically the men figure out a way to prevent uh, girls from turning into dragons. They lose their protection, and then they're invaded and conquered. Basically, right away. So I thought it was really interesting the history that Barnhill puts into this. So while there was dragoning that happened from time to time in 1955, there is a mass dragoning where hundreds of thousands of women turn into dragons. I think it's somewhere like above 600,000 women turn into dragons. Most of them mothers and housewives, but not all of them. Um, and the book deals with the fallout from that. You would think that this would be a major historical event that is studied and thought about and discussed, but information and studying about dragoning leading up to then, and especially of that event, is suppressed. We'll talk a little bit about that today as well. The novel follows Alex Green, as she deals with the fallout of the dragoning. Her aunt Marla was one of the women that turned into dragons, and that results in her having to raise her cousin, who her family just says, "Nope, that's your sister," to kind of get out of talking about why all of a sudden Beatrice is with them. And then also Alex is having to deal the patriarchy of the 1950s from her father, who is more or less absentee, to teachers at school that kind of tell her to, you know, not pursue her education and things like that. So it's a story a lot about rage. Barnhill says in her acknowledgments, I, along with the rest of America, listened with horror and incandescent fury to the brave, stalwart testimony of Christine Blasey Ford as she begged the Senate to reconsider their Supreme Court justice nominee and make a different choice. And I decided to write a different story about rage and dragons, but mostly about rage. And I just thought that was a really interesting thing to way to put it, and because you can feel that rage simmering throughout the book, um, from Alex and others that we get to meet. Because in the novel, women are faced with so little options. They face abuse at home. They're forced to give up on dreams in favor of men. Alex's mother is one of them. She is amazing at math, and she is kind of forced to put that aside. Um, and in response to this just constricting, women turn into dragons. As one says, everything feels so small as she bursts out wings and talons and takes to the sky. You can't really miss the metaphor about how women are contained and constrained within society. And the sad thing that I think is that this story is set in the 1950s, but that metaphor still holds up. Um, Women continue to come forward and tell their stories of sexual assault. That just happened very recently with a woman coming forward and detailing an experience with Elon Musk, for instance. And obviously, there was the testimony from Dr. Ford. The tech industry is rife with abuse. We hear it over and over again. And I have friends in that sector, and those stories break my heart. STEM still has a long way to go to achieve gender equality. There's still a gender pay gap here in 2021, or excuse me, 2022. And of course, the reproductive and health rights of millions of women are going to be taken away. And in no small part because of that Supreme Court justice that Dr. Ford was testifying against and about. And so we're still dealing with this issue. It's really easy to look at a book like When Women Are Dragons, like, oh man, they had it so rough. Women had it so rough in the 1950s, but it's a story about rage. And I just think when we limit the scope of what half of our population can do, that only hurts all of us. We gain nothing from it. And yet there still seems to be this movement that wants to limit women, constrain them within the home, and things like that. I think Barnhill, though, says that rage can be kind of put to use. Um, not just with dragoning, but fighting for what is right. One of the things that I find is really interesting is that a lot of the women who turn into dragons, they go and like eat or set fire to their husbands, and the places that really confined them, and just that acting out against it. Barnhill does look at the consequences of dragoning, which I think is one of the more interesting aspects of the book, because Alex in particular feels abandoned by her aunt, who left behind a daughter of her own. The daughter is Beatrice, and what's really interesting, because I talked about how no one wanted to talk about this event, um, and Beatrice, who is Alex's cousin, comes and lives with them, and then Alex's mother and father are like, "No, that's your sister. You've always had a sister. You've never had an aunt. What are you talking about?" Uh, and they just, they gaslight her basically until she accepts that as the reality. She always knows, like, I know, I remember having an Aunt Marla. Um, what do you, but throughout the book, she's like, it's so easy to lie. It's comforting. It goes along with what everybody else is saying. In general, people seem mad at the women who dragon. There's one point in the book where a neighbor of Alex's yells at a dragon who returned, um, and yells at them because we don't need you anymore. They say, like, you left us. We've gone on without you in these years. We don't need you. Um, Now, does society ever look at why women felt the need to become dragons? No, they do not. Of course they don't, because why? Why would we do that? They will blame the women for fighting back, for standing up for themselves, which, you know, we see that time and time again. I also found it really interesting about where the dragons went, because they went everywhere. My wife is actually starting the book. She's like, "Where do they go?" And I think it's really interesting because they go everywhere. Some explored jungles, some the oceans. The ones that I thought was really beautiful is you had dragons that would go into space and they explored the cosmos. There's one that like basically goes and like studies the moons of Jupiter because that particular dragon was very interested in astronomy, and so they go there. Um, and yes, there's some magical realism and some fantasy elements obviously woven into this. But I thought that was just so cool that these dragons, like, they didn't disappear, like they went and they found purpose as dragons. In the end, there is kind of a mass return of these dragons. I would say most of them come back. And it kind of proves that the insinuation that they didn't care about their families or that they became just beasts and brutes isn't true. They just didn't want to be fully defined by their roles as housewives and mothers. They wanted more. Um, I also find it really interesting that the women get criticized for abandoning families, but there's absentee fathers in this book, especially Alex's, that are allowed to just sort of skate by. Um, and it's just the double standards are rife within the book, which is the point. Another really interesting part of this book is how research into dragoning and information about dragoning is suppressed to the point where nobody wants to talk about it. When there is a dragon around, authorities say just keep your eyes on the ground, keep your eyes down, and stuff like that. And there's this really kind of interesting dichotomy between that, like they just keep your eyes on the ground, don't look up, and women who are about to dragon tend to look up. They look into the sky and things like that. And it's like going from, limit your scope of vision, limit your possibilities to imagine what is there and that you could do. And I find that just like I loved so much about this book. But scientists who wanted to study the dragoning, they're blacklisted. They lose their jobs. They have to go underground. And again, unfortunately, that metaphor works on so many levels. Think about how sex ed is or isn't taught in schools, and people get into adulthood without knowing how women's bodies work. They just don't, and how problematic that is for society. Uh, how many people graduate high school and they don't know how gender identity works? And how gender is really a social construct. What I find really interesting in this book is there are trans dragons in the book. They were sons of people who, you know, we find out through research that they never felt comfortable as sons, and they dragoned. So I thought that was really interesting. There's also, in our society, there's a suppression of research into gun violence, where the CDC, I believe, is prohibited from researching gun violence. Um, and the effects and ramifications of that became very apparent earlier this week, unfortunately, in Texas. So there's a lot of things that this book hits on. Um, and Barnhill just, you know, I think the mark of a good author is she just kind of puts this out here. She doesn't do what I call 2x4 metaphor. Like she doesn't hit you over the head with it, but she lays it out, and you can, as a reader, kind of fill in a lot of those gaps on your own, like I have. And this is how I'm reading it, and I love that about that. Um, Alex says in the book that people don't want to talk about. They don't want to talk about dragoning because it's a feminine issue, and I just think about, like, for instance, things around like a pink tax, which is when feminine products are taxed and poor women can't access them, things like that. um, we don't want to talk about uh, the health care benefits of things like abortion or even birth control beyond the scope that we usually talk about them with, because it's a feminine issue. We don't want to discuss it and things like that as a society. And that lack of knowledge and that lack of ability to discuss it becomes problematic for everyone. And we all hurt because when we don't talk about things, when we limit the scope of the discussion, when we limit what we are allowed to speak about and all of that, again, we all suffer from that. I think also this is a book about a lot of things. It's more than just dragons. It's about the control of the self and kind of wanting to seize your destiny. I think that's a theme in a lot of like fantasy literature, and you could definitely read this as fantasy literature. And Barnhill writes in the book, there's very little we can control in this life. All we can do is accept whatever comes, learn what we can, and hang on to what we love. And that's it. In the end, the only thing you can hope to control is yourself in this moment, which is both a relief and a huge responsibility. All of the women in the book who dragoned, and even those who didn't, all they want is to have that full control of their lives. They want to be who they imagine they can be. We tell our children, I've told the preschooler, you can be whatever you want when you grow up. There's a big world. You can find your niche in it. You can do whatever it is. And when we as a society turn that into a lie or even a half truth, there's issues from that when we take away that control. But we don't take away that control for everyone. It's only select people. And that's where the issues in society arise. Um, I just think the fact that this novel is set in the 1950s, but can still ring very true today. And obviously, it was published this year. It came out like this month, I'm pretty sure. It's a sad reflection of where we are and where we're headed. This isn't like, oh, those women had it so rough in the 1950s. You can imagine that a mass dragoning would happen today. You look at the grief and the outrage that we feel about issues such as reproductive rights and gun control and things like that, and you can picture it. You can picture the mass dragoning happening. You can imagine it, and that's well, it is what it is, I guess. So yeah, I fully recommend this book. I discovered this book on TikTok where someone was excited to read it because it had lesbian dragons in it. That was her phrase that she used it. And there are lesbian dragons in this book, but there's so much in this book. Um, and I really hope that this episode encourages you to pick up this book, to buy it, to check it out from your library, and to read it. It's one of the best books I've read in a while, and it's a book that's so relevant to today for better or for worse. So that is When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill. Again, I cannot recommend it enough. So thank you for watching this episode of Alan Drinks Whiskey and Talks About Books. I'm not going to make any promises about when I will be back because who knows, but I do hope to make more of these over the summer when I have a little bit more time on my hands to do so. So until then, happy reading and cheers.